connectivity infrastructure, including in the development of exchange points. And indeed, there's still a lot of work to be done on the infrastructure side, and there's still barriers and challenges that need to be improved. But content and content distribution, I think, is really the next key piece of the ecosystem that we need to focus on to really energize the markets in Africa. At the end of the day, users don't just want to be connected to infrastructure. They want to be connected to content. That's the point of the infrastructure in the first place. IXPs aren't that valuable if they just connect access networks together. It's kind of like having a party without girls or a pub with no beer if an IXP doesn't have content. Users in eyeball networks need to be connected to content, and if you have an IXP without the content piece, you're missing a fundamental piece of what makes it valuable. ISOC released a study in January this year in conjunction with RICTA, looking at local content hosting and the development of the internet ecosystem. Unfortunately, we ran out of hard copies, but it's available on our website. And one of the key things here, and we used Rwanda as a case study to try and get some numbers and real-world examples. But, if content isn't distributed closely to end users, it's going to have a significant negative impact on costs to network operators. It has a significant negative impact on the user experience. And overall, it depresses overall internet consumption. So that's why that content is really a big piece of the whole access equation. And it's really time to start looking about how we energize that part of the ecosystem. There is a lot to do if we want to get to 80/20 by 2020 in terms of the AFPIF vision and charge. There's obviously various different numbers, and we had a discussion earlier today about how much of African content is consumed from overseas. One data point that we quote in the report is that up to 90% of the content that Africa consumes is from overseas. Earlier today or yesterday, we had a data point that 90% of African developed internet content is hosted overseas. That's kind of consistent with what we found, at least in the Rwanda case study. So there's a lot to do there. So in order to sort of hit the 80/20 by 2020, we really got to focus on bringing Africa home, bringing African content home, bringing the world of content to Africa, and also making sure that Africa is not just a content consumer, but also a content creator on par with the rest of the world. Those are, I think, the real three keys of what we need to focus on. How do we bring it home? How do we bring the world to Africa? And then how do we generate more content here? So on this panel, we are going to focus a little bit on content delivery networks as well as content regulation in this panel. One of the reasons is that it's a really hot topic, a topic of much interest. And of course, the infrastructure is going in for things now like data centers. There are still issues with people having the ability to host locally. We all know that South Africa is farther ahead than most places in Africa than most, with Kenya coming up behind. But really encouraging CDNs in country is really one of the quickest ways at the moment to increase the amount of local traffic exchange. And I'm sure there's some that want to debate on whether that's a good thing or not. But for example, as we heard from Tanzania and TICS, aggregate traffic at TICS went up from 80 megs to 800 megs within a half week of them installing the Google Global Cache, and up to 1.5 gigs a couple months later. So it had a really significant impact. And at Rhinex, immediately when the Akamai cache was turned on, there was an increase in traffic of about 4%, and that's one of the things that we talk about in our study. So CDNs can really have a big impact in terms of bringing international traffic local. And of course, one thing we also know is that it's not just, sometimes people talk about CDNs and they say, oh, that's just international traffic, right? That's not our content. One of the things we talk about a bit in the study, and as you know, a lot of African content developers use international platforms in which to host their content. So, you know, newspapers use YouTube to put stories on there. So this line between what's local and not local content from a cultural perspective, I think, is sometimes a discussion that gets in the way of looking at making sure that bits that people want to get and see are actually local, no matter where they come from. We've got a really great lineup to talk about the impact, the issues, and the barriers to local content distribution. And we hope to talk a little bit more about the content production side when we get to the discussion. But with that, I'll give just a quick overview of introduction to our panel, and then we will take it through the presentations. So we've got Christian Kaufmann from Akamai, and he's going to be talking about a little bit about content delivery networks and content distribution from an Akamai perspective. Thomas Volmer from Google is going to talk about lessons learned and challenges from a Google perspective and experience from a Google perspective in distributing content in Africa. Gilan Nikira Mugaba from RICTA and also Rhinex, the Rwandan IX, is going to talk about CDN distribution through Rhinex and how they actually handle distributing CDN traffic to their members. And they have a pretty interesting model, which I'm sure will spur some debate. And then we will hear from William Stucke. He's from ISOC-GP province in South Africa, and he was also a former commissioner, but it's not called a commissioner. What was it called? Counselor. A former counselor at the South African Regulatory Agency, and he's going to talk about South African content legislation and intermediary liability. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to our first speaker, Christian Kaufmann from Akamai.
Thanks, Karen, for the microphone and for the analogy. Putting that into perspective. So, if girls and parties fit together as content and IXs, and the IX is the party, then that makes me the beautiful girl in that round. This said, I think I was never approached more by men I wasn't knowing than this week, so probably that part is true. So, I will talk about the challenges and the experience we as Akamai have in Africa. Probably before I start, a short disclaimer to a point to put things into perspective. So, Akamai is a CDN, one of these acronyms which were used this week quite a lot, a content distribution network. What is a little bit different than probably the next speaker from Google is that the content which we are distributing is actually not our own. So there are a lot of content companies who own the content in the world, which needs a delivery mechanism to deliver that content to you, to us, and we are one of them. So we are like a different kind of specialized provider, but we are not owning the content and it's not our own. So, pushing the button, here we go. The one marketing slide to give a little bit an overview about the size. The numbers are actually not so much important. Important is probably the last one, which is 130 countries. I think it's 136, 137. So we are quite distributed in the world, and in comparison to 2 years ago, when I was standing here for a similar topic, I think we had around 75, 80 countries. So we are quite keen in going into more countries, and Africa is certainly where we have a focus on. One of the fancy slides. A short explanation how you actually can get Akamai traffic. There are like 3 easy ways. We have the eyeball network on the right top, and that one has eyeballs like us. And if one of these eyeballs want to go to the content and download the website or one of our content, then the three options would be: number one, we have a server in that eyeball network. This is what we call the on-net, or the AANP, which is the Akamai marketing term for it. So that means that the majority of the traffic from that eyeball network stays in the network. It's very close to the eyeballs, and you can download it straight from there. The second best option, if you do not have a cache in your own network, is that you get it via a peering. So peering, as we heard this week, has all the benefits of hopefully a better performance if it's not somewhere in Europe but close by. And it certainly has the benefit that you don't pay on a per meg base because it is not transit. So we peer at various internet exchanges in the world, and if we peer at one of them with you, then you would get the content from there. The preference still, if you have on-net, would be on-net first, and then if either the cluster is in a worst case down or full, or the content, the particular one, is not in that cluster, you would go to the internet exchange. So it's actually complementary. One does not replace the other. If both of us are quite unlucky and there is no cluster in your network or no peering connection, then you get it via transit, and then there is not so much we can do besides building a cluster, and then the eyeball network pays for it on a per Mbit base, whatever the rate might be with the specific provider. Keeping that in mind, especially with Africa, I didn't put any milliseconds on because it varies for every country quite a lot. But if the cache is in your network, then whatever the diameter of your network in milliseconds is the slowest speed you would get. So whatever, 10, 20, let it be a really big country, 30 milliseconds. The peering connection, even if it has an economical benefit, if the peering cluster, because you peer with us just in London, and you, for example, is then still the 200, 250 milliseconds, whatever, back to London. So you have the economical benefit, but not the performance and latency benefit. And transit really depends where the cluster might be. The ISOC and we did a case study, and we distributed some numbers to it, and that was the case of Rwanda last year. The graph is a little bit hard to read probably. The right one, which is the full solid block, shows the throughput. This is before we deployed a cluster in Rwanda. So Rwanda was served from all over the world, mainly some places in Europe. And the left side is what happened after we put clusters in the country itself. The green bar, which is like 80–90%, shows the throughput below 500K. So that throughput comes from the fact that either the cluster was very far away and you didn't get much throughput through sea cable, half through Europe and wherever it was, with a last mile, and or probably the second reason was that your last mile access just wasn't much bigger than 500K, so you don't get much more over it anyway. After we deployed the cluster, which is the graph on the left side, you see that the green bar is now actually much smaller. It's like roughly 50%. So the people which just had 500K, they were now, instead of 80–90%, just 50%. So like whatever, 30–40% had now a higher speed than before. And some of them even had speeds up to 20 meg. So whoever had a fixed line, probably from an office in Rwanda, could now use it to the full speed as everywhere else in the world. If the throughput goes up, the latency goes down, then suddenly the whole internet makes much more fun. The blue graph, which goes very much to the 50–60% mark, is the percentage of in-country delivery. So before we had the cluster, it was of course 0, because there was no cluster in the country. So you see, at the day where we switched it on, like half of the traffic from the country went to the cluster. And then the green graph is the peak traffic. So after people figured out over the next couple of days, well, now actually this website works much faster than it was before. Oh, now suddenly I can actually download it in a decent speed. They start to like it. And you see that the traffic, especially with peaks also for events, goes up by the factor of 2 or 3. So having some cluster from a CDN perspective, regardless which one it is, local and much closer to you, makes not just a throughput and a latency difference, you also see that people then start enjoying it. Last slide. Talking a little bit about transit. So this week there were like, I don't know, like probably 10 people or so which asked all these transit questions, and there was quite some mix-up of what is transit, when do we pay, where is the transit coming from, what is needed for which kind of cluster. So I thought I'd give a short overview to put that a little bit into perspective. The easiest but probably most sad part is if you do not have a cluster and no peering, no whatever, then you get it via transit, and that's end of the discussion. Then whatever your demand is from your eyeballs is what comes down into your network via your transit connection, and you pay for it, and if the cluster is far away, then you have all these performance latency components which we talked before. Let's take easy numbers. That could be 500 Mbit, just for argument's sake for the other examples afterwards. If you have an on-net cluster, so your own cluster, in your network, then this 500 Mbit becomes actually just 100 Mbit transit. You could call it transit, but end of the day, well, we call it then cache fill, because what happens is you have to fill the content into the cache, and the cache acts as a multiplier. With a rough ratio, depending on country, location, and a couple of other factors, we probably talk about 1 to 5-ish in Africa. So the 500 Mbit, which we just talked about, which come in via transit, suddenly become 100 Mbit. And then the cluster multiplies it and sends it out multiple times. So that not just has the benefit of the performance and the latency, it also puts the boundary where you get charged from your transit provider, the multiplier, in your network. If you don't have it, then you get everything into it. If you have it, then you get 100 Mbit in, and the cluster multiplies it, and you can deliver the 500 Mbit. So you have, whatever, 400 Mbit of savings, whatever the price in your particular market might be. The third version which we have is the Internet Exchange. So the Internet Exchange, like any other cluster, needs a cache fill. The content, the website, I usually make a comment about the song of Rihanna, which I want to download, has to come into the cluster, the first case, before it can be sent out. So for that we need transit with a full internet routing table and connectivity for that particular cache. The transit seems, well, really depending on the region, but the transit in Africa in comparison to Europe, and we have seen that this week multiple times, also from Telegeography this morning, is much, much more expensive. So from a business case perspective, in our case, we really have a hard time, to pay for that, because the difference is, in the Western world, you have sub $1. Here, you might have up to $100, $200. So everything becomes like 200 times more expensive. So from a business case perspective, that doesn't really fly. So what we do is, and we look for someone who helps us with the transit component. So we found over the years different model, either different people chip together, or we find a provider who has a benefit of providing that transit for multiple business case reasons. So he gets a benefit out of it as well. But the most important part is, at the moment where the traffic then comes into the cache, himself, the one who sponsors the transit, but also the other people in the ecosystem in that particular internet exchange, actually get the traffic not just faster and much closer to them, but also cheaper, because now again the cluster multiplies it, and you need the 100 Mbit instead of the 500 Mbit. So end of the day, this is not just from a performance perspective a win-win situation, but also from an economical perspective. Good. That was my part. I think the questions are coming later, so yeah. Good.
Great, thanks a lot, Christian. I'm sure we're going to get a number of questions on that. And next is Thomas Volmer from Google.
Thanks, Karen, and thanks, Christian. So I'm done. Most of what I needed to say have been said by Christian. No, so yeah, essentially the Google CDN and the Akamai CDN seem to operate somewhat similarly, but there are a few specific points I wanted to make from a kind of Google perspective. So first of all, it is true that we own some of our content. Some of the content that we deliver through our network is Google website. But not just, and in fact we also strive on local content. We strive on local internet businesses. They could be restaurants, hotel reservation platforms, TV that go online, any kind of those companies that make money out of the internet are good for Google as well, because essentially the way we make money is when people make money on the internet and then want to advertise for this, and they usually advertise for this on the place that helps them get found on the internet, and most of the time, luckily for us, is Google. If you only have people online and no businesses, then what you have is essentially a social network that's good for sending SMS or maybe pictures, but that's about it, and there's not much business or growth for everybody. So I want to say that we want also a kind of local content, and those come from local business initiatives. They come from local entrepreneurs, people that are trained, that are willing to make money from their own companies and start their business and especially put them online. So this is, I would say, a very wide question. Now, of course, there are also some of the content that, at least from a management perspective in hosting and delivery, is ours. That's the main one we have, at least in terms of bandwidth, is YouTube. And I think YouTube content is both local and global, because for those type of content like video, in fact, global content is sometimes relevant at the local scale. So everybody likes to go on YouTube, see their favorite players, play a football game or a video game even now. They like to see their favorite animals doing funny tricks. I've learned this week about elephants surfing on sand dunes in Namibia. I haven't seen that on YouTube yet, but I want to see that, hopefully next year at SAFNOG. So we do have local content. It's just global content that is relevant locally. And to deliver that content, we have our own CDN architecture that has some specificities. In fact, we have two tiers of CDN architecture. First one is the Google owned and operated backbone network, so our own capacities on submarine cables all around Africa, and mainly we peer out of 3 locations on the continent: Mombasa, Kenya, on the East Coast, hosted by CCOM but accessible by everybody, hopefully; Terraco in South Africa, in Johannesburg, and then on the West Coast we are in Lagos, the Medallion facility. That facility has for long been kind of under capacity, but hopefully this will change, and I hope that next year I come to you with one of the biggest POP in West Africa. So from there we peer, we run our own AS number, AS15169, and anybody who can meet us can peer and exchange traffic for free. Obviously this comes with a cost. The cost essentially of building capacity and hosting gear at those exchanges. And then one step further from this first tier of architecture, we have the Google Global Cache program, which has been talked about quite a bit, and it's essentially those caching servers that we deliver to ISPs all around the continent, and for which the only prerequisite is essentially to have enough traffic to your own users. So if you have customers that watch YouTube, that watch those elephants surfing or any other animal surfing, then most likely you have enough traffic from us, and you can have your own cache. There's no discrimination. It's a very open program. Of course, this requirement of enough traffic is in itself a discrimination, because in an environment where few people are connected or internet access is expensive, then of course traffic comes with a price tag. Today, any network that receives over 1 gigabit per second peak time from AS15169 in Africa, I think they're eligible for their own cache, so you can connect with me. I think there's the peering address behind for anybody who wants to connect. And then beyond that, one possibility that we have is to have people come together and share a cache. So, I'm an operator, I'm too small, you're an operator, you're too small to have your own cache, so let's work together and have one cache for the both of us. Typically, that can be done with an internet exchange, but that's not mandatory. It could be hosted by one ISP and be accessible from another ISP. There's all sorts of mechanisms in there, but I think the key is really cooperation between the local members of the internet community. Because there's one thing I cannot do. I'm the one guy for all of those caching servers in Africa. I cannot be dealing with commercial disputes between African ISPs. Some of you compete, some of you cooperate, some of you are customers of each other. It's very complicated, so in the end it has to be dealt with locally. And usually a good indication that a market is mature to have its own local content and local thriving internet economy is the fact that, are you able to simply share a bunch of server machines? So that's a good start. And for that, I think the example of Guilain in Rwanda coming up later will be, I hope, a good example that can be replicated in many other markets. And in fact, that has been replicated in many other markets. In Botswana, there's a very successful shared cache. In Ghana as well. Many other countries. I think Uganda is on the way. Tanzania has been spoken about previously. So there are examples, and there's not one way to do it. There's not one right way to do it. It's just whatever works. And eventually, when there is enough demand from everybody gets their own cache. It's a figure I've given many times during this week. In a country like Poland that has maybe 40 million inhabitants, we have more than 50 or 70 caches with so many different ISPs. So it's not a big deal. If there is demand, we'll ship more cache, and that's not an issue. Now, another part of that I want to tackle in this panel is really the barriers to having more local content, more local delivery of content. So we've talked about it. I think enough traffic, enough demand is essential to have those kind of caching machines I was talking about. Then if you want to connect to the next tier of infrastructure where you get everything that is not from the cache, the 20% of the traffic that Christian was talking about, then you need to be able to connect to the local peering hubs. So Johannesburg is a big local peering hub. We have peers from Botswana, from Namibia, from Swaziland coming there. Obviously, to enable this kind of local exchange of traffic, a key point is the cost of getting there, the cost of this cross-border infrastructure. And for this, I think there are not 100 ways to do it. First of all, a progressive-looking regulation towards capacity and the cost of exchanging that, and then daring companies, daring business people who are willing to build such capacity and wholesale it as an aggressive price. So I think among the sponsors of the conference, you have such companies obviously doing this type of business, and we think that it's a very good business to attract content providers. In fact, this is what attracted us to South Africa in the first place. In East Africa, there are similar challenges. I think Richard Bell earlier in the week talked about the example, unfortunately, I think not so good, of Tanzania, which has very expensive and almost monopolistic price of long-haul capacity. So that's a barrier. That's definitely a barrier to carry content. But nevertheless, despite all those barriers to capacity, we've been, I think, quite successful in achieving a lot of those objectives for local content delivery. Actually, when I hear about this 80% by 2020, I think we're already there. I checked yesterday, and in South Africa we have 96% of the Google traffic that's local. Here in Mozambique is about 40% local or regional. Kenya is about 80%, Senegal 68%, Rwanda 76%, Uganda 52%, Tanzania itself 80%. So there's already quite a lot of local content that is going there, and hopefully now what's coming next is the actual local companies doing business on the internet that essentially are going to bring business to the global content players as well, such as us. For this, obviously, it's a wider issue. Business rules. An acronym I learned about is TTL, Tax, Treasury, and Law. That's important to get payment. If you're a developer and you're developing Android apps, you cannot get paid for those Android apps in most African countries, unfortunately, and that's precisely because of those tax, treasury, or laws that are a barrier basically to getting paid as an Android content producer or as a YouTube content producer for that matter. Finally, there's training. You need to have tech-savvy people, business-savvy people to launch those businesses on the internet. And then, yeah, essentially local skills. So I think the conclusion is that it's really a good opportunity, because I feel that content delivery is a problem that's almost easily solved if you have the right mindset. And then it's a question of bringing the local skills and the local know-how, which I think we're all excited about on this panel and in this conference. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Thomas. I thought it was really interesting when you brought in at the end the things about taxation and payments, especially we were having a discussion earlier in some of the panels about everybody's really excited about doing app development. There's like much fewer network engineers, and it's really interesting to hear that, you know, even in Africa people are really interested in doing apps and content, but they can't get paid for them because of some of these regulations and problems on the financial side. So I think that's a great linkage with another of the problems that we've been talking about this week. So next we'll go to Gilan Nikiramugaba from RICTA, the Rwanda ICT Association, and Rhinex, the Rwanda Internet Exchange Point, to talk about how Rhinex manages the distribution of CDN content to its members.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for the opportunity to share our experience as Rwanda. My name is Gilan Hiramugawa. I'm the CEO of RICTA Rwanda ICT Association, and we run the Rwanda Internet Exchange, which is branded Rhinex actually. So I'm going to, before I do my presentation, I just wanted to put some things in perspective. Actually, what I'm going to share today as experience is something that started in AFPIF 2013 in Morocco. Actually, the first contact we had with Akamai were during that meeting. So I bumped into Andrew Basket and we discussed, and we had some statistics. As Rwanda, we say we are seeing more or less like 600 megabits going out of the country. How can we do that? And standing, I think it was just in front here, and then we exchanged business card, and then from there, the journey started. So AFPIF meeting is really bringing fruits to not only the continent, but as Rwanda in particular. So Rhinex has, we have more or less like 15 ASNs. Our peak traffic is a little bit lower than 1 gig overall aggregated. And I wanted as well to put this forward. Attracting CDNs in Rwanda is not an end in itself. It's the beginning. It's the low-hanging fruits that we wanted. Now we have Google and Akamai. We are looking at other CDNs as well, but it's not an end in itself. We, as Karen has mentioned it, we need to develop a non-existing content industry. So we are moving forward. It's not the end. It's just sharing our experience, and then we move forward. So, yeah. So these are just details. Rhinex actually is in its 11th year of operation. So we started in 2004. Not-for-profit organization, limited by guarantee. We are not member-based as such, but we work for the better of the community. So we have advisory committee on our governance structure. We have a registrar governance advisory committee. We have an ISP governance advisory committee to collect views and to work for the benefit of the community, even if it is a company, a private company limited by guarantee. So the problem we had was an importation problem as a whole country, as Rwanda. Kaufmann said that, 500 megabit per second. And the deal with Andrew that time was, we give you the cluster, but you deal with the power, you deal with the transit, you deal with everything. So we wanted it badly, yes, but by the time we were discussing, we did not know how much that will cost us. So the problem here was, how will we finance the transit leak, which is more or less like 2 STM1 or an STM4, expensive for an exchange point. That time we were not having any port fees, so we were figuring out how are we going to finance this. Are we going to ask for an ISP to sponsor? So it was very difficult. So what we went for was for a tender. We said, okay, we have two problems. The first problem is the capacity is too much, we can't pay for it. The second problem is, if we do have that capacity, we are likely not to become an IXP anymore. We're going more or less to become an ISP. So that's the problem we have and the challenge we had. So we said, let's do a tender. Let's have the cache, the cluster at the exchange point, so the cluster will not be moved from one ISP to another ISP and so on and so forth, and located at where the exchange point is. And the cache will only be distributed through the exchange point. One thing to note is that we made sure that we will not get any fees from the one who will be managing the cluster and getting money out of reselling the cache and the other ISP. We will not get into the middle. They will be doing a contractual agreement, but not us being involved. For us, we wanted to keep our business model simple, getting revenues from the port and port model. So this is the design we had. As Kaufmann said, the ratio for in and out was 1 to 4.8, which is more 1 to 5. So for 1 meg that gets in, there is 5 meg getting out. Actually, one of the good things that is happening is that we are upgrading the cluster. So we are likely to see a ratio increasing from 1 to more than 5. That will be a very good thing. So we noticed that 350 to 5 megabit was in, 1.2 gig out. So we collected these data during the test period. So one ISP agreed to give capacity for 1 month without making us pay, for us to figure out the ratio. So the ratio, we took the ratio and they had different conditions. We put that into a request for quotation, and then we issued that to the ISP, to the local ISP. One thing I want to stress here is that all this, what we did with all the ISP. It was transparent. We did not want to say, we did not want any player, any ISP in Rwanda to come and say it was not fairly done and so on and so forth. So everything was documented, minutes of meetings distributed and so on and so forth. So the tender, we had 3 ISPs. One of the ISP said, okay, I will sell the cache at $80 a meg. The second one said 19, and the last one said $12 per meg. Since the tender was competitive and to the lowest price, we went for the $12, and it was awarded to one of the ISP in Kigali, BSC. So that helped us keep our model switching, and as Kaufmann said, the end user seeing the value and the quality of what they were getting, they started consuming more and more, and it brought value to our exchange point. So on a global scale as Rwanda, there are savings. There are savings, and everybody is sharing the cost of importing that content in Rwanda. And it has proven to be sustainable because the ISP providing the transit will be able to pay for the costs to bring that from the revenues he's getting. Plus, I guess, marginal profit. I will not be calling that profit, but it's profit. But it is sane. You are getting a content at 2 milliseconds away and at $12. I believe it's good. And even the small ISP would benefit from this. So this last slide, this last slide, with the permission of Kyle, I just wanted to, Kyle from UIXP Uganda, I just wanted to stress the fact that the free model was not and is not sustainable. The case in GGC in Uganda was that there are 2 instances, and none of the ISP wanted to share the cache. So what happened is that one of the ISP there got the cache, installed it, give it for free through the exchange point. But as more and more ISP get connected to the exchange point, the transit on the sponsoring ISP, the transit pipe keep on growing and the cost was not recouped. At the end, what the ISP did is he narrowed that link to the exchange point to, if I'm correct, maybe Kyle will correct me, to 100 meg link. And everybody was being squashed into that 100 meg, and there were no value. So what happened is that the second biggest operator just decided, okay, let me get another GGC within the country. So that's led to a second GGC in the country, but they could have gained advantage of sharing. Because I believe even the second ISP will not get that content at less than what they could have paid it for if they had shared it. So it's a win-win situation, and we believe that for us it's not a cut and stone model. If the traffic increase and grow, maybe Akamai will decide, okay, let me peer directly to the exchange point. But we will have created a demand that will not get back, that will not go back. So thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Gilan. I think that was a really great practical example also of how an IX also needs to manage the issue of not looking like it's competing with its members. And I think that's a lot of really great information about how that can be managed in one particular way and that experience there. So now we'll move to William Stucke of ISOC-GP province in South Africa, again also former counselor at the South African Regulatory Agency. And he's going to talk to us about South African content legislation intermediary liability, which has also come up earlier this week. Obviously, South Africa is, seen as ahead, especially when it comes to things like carrier-neutral data centers and local content. And I think there's some interesting another perspective in terms about how legislation can potentially harm or help the market. So with that, I'll turn it over to William Stucke.
Thank you, Karen. I'm an independent consultant, and one of the hats I wear is ISOC. I also represent the Wi-Fi Forum in South Africa. And generally speaking, when I get to talk about internet censorship, I need to be censored. But the Commissar has instructed me to do this, so I will talk about this subject. And the usual disclaimer applies, of course. The most important act in terms of this issue was the Electronic Communications and Transactions Act, and I can't even read it from here. was passed in 2002, and it had 4 important chapters. The Chapter 3 was the one that really needed it. It could, in fact, have ended at Chapter 3. But that facilitated electronic transactions, and it was crucial in that it gave legal recognition to data messages. Prior to that, an email or any message was not legally recognized. So what that has meant is that effectively it has extended the ambit of the ordinary law to the cyber world, if you like. It also included some consumer protection and included facilities to outlaw spam, protection of personal information, and then Chapter 10 was the domain name authority and administration chapter, and this caused enormous controversy, which was eventually resolved with the establishment of what's called the ZADNA, the South African Domain Name Authority, which was largely adopted the principles which were previously reached by Namespace, which was a private sector organization set up to do the same sort of thing, and the people who chose the people on the ZADNA board were the people who were running the organization, run the domain name system previously, and who were part of Namespace. So it actually all worked out reasonably well. Next button. The Chapter 11 was a very important chapter for the purposes of what we're talking about today. It was limitation of liability of service providers, and it gave mere conduit status to ISPs, provided that they did certain things, provided they were members of a recognized industry representative body, which enforces a code of conduct and has a notice and takedown procedure, and if you follow that procedure and you do take down the notices, you have no liability, including from your customer whose information you've taken down. And it was eventually recognized after having sat on the desk of the previous incumbent for 5 years. It was eventually recognized by General Sipiwe Nyanda in 2009. And as a result of this, him doing this in his first week, he was known as General Surprise. This also was not entirely unrelated to the fact that he spent his entire 18 months as a minister in a hotel because he didn't like his house. The takedown statistics for last year, as you can see, the majority of the takedown notices were complied with, and the second largest category was ones that didn't apply at all because they weren't members of ISPA. And in terms of takedown notices by type, most of it was because of trademark and copyright infringement, and I can't read what the second one was. Oh, phishing and hate speech and that sort of thing. The other chapters in the ECT Act dealt with things like e-government services, cryptography providers, authentication service providers, protection of critical databases, cyber inspectors. Would you believe that our beloved government actually had the idea that they would have thousands of people paid to surf the internet to find something bad? Okay. And cybercrime. And most of these chapters remain only partially or even unimplemented 13 years later. But there's other stuff that's relevant. There's the Film and Publications Act, which dates from 1996, but it's been revised many times. And it classifies films, games, and publications. And ISPs, Internet Service Providers, must register with the FPB and renew it every year. There's the Independent Communications Authority of South Africa Act, the ICASA Act, which together with the ECA, the Electronic Communications Act, at the bottom there, govern what I did as a regulator, and it's all in this little book. Then there's the RICA Act, the Regulation of Interception and Provision of Interception of Communications, actually, words missing, and Provision of Interception-Related Information Act, say that quickly 3 times. And that defines, as does the Film and Publications Act, a service provider as anybody. So if you're providing access to your family via your Wi-Fi router on your ADSL line, you are a service provider. Oops. And it required Internet service providers to spend millions in installing interception equipment, and all service providers had to RICA their customers. They had to have a face-to-face process where you verified that the person actually matches the picture on his ID and provides proof of residence. And there are additional requirements for service providers who are using SIMs, subscriber identity modules in cellular phones. as is so often happens, good intentions, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. The net effect of this is that it's enormously increased the impact or the possibilities for identity theft. There are now some 100,000 supermarket cashiers who have access to your personal identification information because you can do it at the supermarket, and it doesn't stop the criminals at all, naturally. Then the Film and Publication Board has brought out in March this year a draft on online regulation policy. And this attracted widespread criticism for being over-wide and a whole lot of other things. The usual excuse, of course, was used: we've got to protect the children. And you can pass any bill, and you can justify. Governments can justify any abrogation of liberty by either using children or terrorism, and we've seen it happen all over the world. But there were hearings, there was no outcomes, there were no criticisms or submissions have been published, there's been a lack of public consultation, and it's a badly written document. It's unconstitutional, it's unlawful and unimplementable. I'm quoting a lawyer here. It intentionally conflates pornography with child sexual abuse material, and it classifies McDonald's as an internet service provider, but Vodacom isn't one. Okay. Then we have something called the Film and Publication Amendment Bill 2015, and as I said, there are 4 previous amendments to this. It was approved by Cabinet the week before last. It's not yet published, and it has not yet reached the Parliamentary Portfolio Committee, where it can be debated in public. So it's not publicly available. However, we do have some ideas about what it's about. Where's the thing? There. The real answer to protecting children in hyperspace is actually summarized in this image here. It's about education. It's about talk to your child about the risks of being online. It's about awareness. It's about being aware of what your child is doing, and it's about privacy. Teach your child not to share personal information with strangers. And please do remember, everything you put on Facebook is there forever. So the Film and Publication Amendment proposals include things like obligations on internet service providers to filter content. So it's no longer a government's problem, it's suddenly your problem. Oops. If you're an online distributor, whatever that means, then you must register with the Film and Publication Board and pay an annual fee. If you're an online distributor, you may self-classify the content, but you must pay a per-title fee. And you must display the Film and Publication Board logo and classification prominently with all the content. So you can imagine every YouTube video being preceded by this. Right. And it applies to anyone who provides content accessible in South Africa. That includes people like the New York Times, the BBC, YouTube. Do you really think they want to register with the South African Film and Publication Board? Is this really practical? What we should be doing is we should be proactive, and we should accept that there will be some form of online content control imposed in South Africa, and also that it will be badly done. We must recognize that all who participate in and rely on online content have a shared responsibility, and I refer you to the picture just now. The self-regulatory and co-regulatory models have been shown to work, and they can work, and we must develop and push educational campaigns at parents, teachers and children, and we must remember the importance of internet intermediary neutrality and not try and abrogate that. Thank you.
That was really great and delivered with such energy in the afternoon on day 3. That's fantastic. So I'd like to go to questions now. So if we could get some hands in the air for the people who have questions, that would be great. But first, what I'd like to do to kind of tie some of this a little bit together is ask our CDN folks, or Akamai and Google, in terms of the legal aspects of when you all make decisions on where to put a cache or where to put a pop, what are the kinds of things that you all generally look at in making a decision when it comes to the legal or regulatory environment related to content or liability in a market?
Yeah, so frankly, I don't. Those are really engineering decisions. Usually, if there's even a talk of a legal aspect to it, then that means, yeah, that's a no-go from the start.
So, one step back probably. What we usually do when, also when we want to sell into a country, we make a full legal review to which degree the company, Akamai, is liable for the content which we transport. As I said before, we are just transporting it. We are not owning it. So what we look at is, does that particular country make a provider liable for it? Which then we, of course, have a problem. Because, you know, we don't, similar like an ISP, we don't know exactly what you transport or what would be against a particular law in a particular country. So this is certainly a point we look for. The other parts would be, do we need a license? Are we a telecommunications company or not? And these kind of things. So end of the day, it's mainly a risk mitigation question. Can we operate in that environment, and what does it mean in a worst case scenario?
Okay, questions from the floor. We've got two back there. Andrew, and it's late. Kyle, and then Roel. Kyle, Andrew, Roel.
Right, yeah, Kyle, the Internet Exchange point. I just wanted to clarify that slide in the talk about what happened with the cache in Uganda for the sake of clarity. There was an ISP that was sharing GGC across the IX for free, and as more big networks turned up at the exchange, the cache fill transit costs started to become noticeably larger, and so they stopped sharing it. So now we're working on doing a model similar to what Rwanda is doing. It was not related to traffic limitations or congestion or anything like that.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew from Liquid. Just two comments. Firstly, with regards to caches on internet exchanges, etc. Liquid obviously has a fair number of CDNs that we host on our network, and I'd just like to clarify some of the reasons why we don't push those to IXPs, and interestingly enough, at the moment they are not cost related. They're not the cache full that's stopping us doing it. It's got to do with the BGP routing. When we were feeding GGC caches into the Kenyan Internet Exchange, what we found was that providers were pushing aggregate routes to the internet exchanges and de-aggregates to their transit providers. And this was mapping to the caches. At that point, traffic would flow out of the caches onto our routers, hit the full transit providers, and instead of going across the exchanges, go out via our transits. This was hurting the experience of everybody mapping to those caches and eating all our outbound bandwidth. So it wasn't a cost-based thing, it was more a routing-based issue. And we've openly said that if we are convinced that the routing issues have been fixed, we are quite prepared to continue feeding those caches to the exchanges that we're at. It's just about getting the routing right. We did attempt to work with a lot of providers to fix their routing, but we actually found quite a bit of resistance and were told, don't tell us how to route. So that is something that, kind of from a perspective of someone who was feeding those caches to exchanges, and it is something that we are evaluating all the time. Then my other question to the panel has got to do with content creation in Africa.
Sorry, may I actually jump in and make a comment to what you just said? Because the timing is probably better. Is that okay?
Yeah.
So the CDNs are a little bit tricky sometimes, and I think that not necessarily that the particular problem you mentioned was necessarily, related to all CDNs or just one or whatever. But the point is they all work slightly different, and it's not unfortunately 100% transparent to all the ISPs what happens in the background. So that goes back to the presentation Jala, my colleague, had 2 days ago. If you see something which is suspicious or you don't like, or it is different than you expect, it is a good idea to contact that particular CDN and talk to it. This at least in case of Akamai, what we do is we build for under certain assumptions. So one assumption is that we get all the routes from you, that you have no split, that you do not do inconsistent announcements, or inconsistent is actually most times fine, but not incomplete announcements, so that certain prefixes are missing and all that kind of stuff. If you play too much around with it, then that might have side effects. If you then don't like the side effects, which is a fair point, please contact us, and we usually are capable of fixing it. Either having an opinion, what might be the solution, and then we can see if it fits for you, or we can work around and try to mitigate, because we have a little bit more options than just, setting AS pass prepends metrics and stuff like that. We basically can make a decision in our mapping system, the way how we decide where we serve you, and can then therefore mitigate for your traffic engineering. So please contact the particular CDN if it breaks and let us know how we can help you. Thanks.
Thanks. I mean, that's good news, and we'll definitely, continue talking and looking at the options, because we would like to actually serve that stuff to the IXPs. My other question for the panel is just around the creation of local content. I was looking at some stats just now about traffic in Europe. And if you look at traffic in Europe, the vast majority of it, YouTube, Netflix, none of that traffic, well, the vast minority of that traffic is actually created in Europe. If you look at the traffic actually created in Europe, the content created, a lot of it is very specific to particular countries, and the traffic levels are relatively low compared to the traffic coming out of Hollywood. Same with BitTorrent, geographically agnostic. So my question is it about content created in Africa, or is it about content located in Africa? Because we tend to conflate these issues, and I've been saying this for a long, long time. I really believe that we need to concentrate on where traffic is located, not necessarily where it's created. Because at the end of the day, it's the end user that decides what they want to watch. And if the end user wants to watch a video made in Hollywood or Bollywood or Nollywood, that's their choice. We can't dictate that. What we can do is make sure that it's located in the correct place. So I'd like to hear, is it about where it's created or where it's located?
Yeah, if you don't mind, we touched on this issue in the report that I mentioned that we released in January. And I think it depends on from what aspect you're looking at the issue. So particularly especially from a government perspective and a civil society perspective, local content is more about culture than it is about delivery and economics of internet consumption. So from that perspective, the interest there is more from the cultural angle. What we did when we wrote the paper is we made this distinction exactly that you're making, because when you're talking about the economics of the internet and performance and growing user consumption, it's a different calculation. So I would make an argument that the video from Psy, Gangnam Style, right, it's American content. Right, it's made in Korea, but it's played at every wedding, it's played at every prom, right? I mean, it's part of the American culture. So just because it's made in Korea, I mean, that's relevant. The same thing too, like a user, and we made this example, is that, a user downloading a Microsoft Windows update, that's content that's locally relevant to them. They want their computer to work, thank you very much. So the categories that we use in talking about more of the economic and performance side, we talked about locally relevant content, and in that definition we said it's basically the content that users in a location are interested in. May be developed locally, may be developed internationally. It may be locally developed content like a newspaper, but it's hosted overseas. It's the content that people in that area want to see. It's locally relevant. And then we talked about locally delivered or locally available content, which gets to this issue of where is that content being delivered. It can be locally developed content, but still, like in the case of Rwanda, other than the government websites, all of the top 20 websites in Rwanda, like the newspapers and everything, that's all hosted overseas, right? So that is locally relevant. It's also locally developed, but it's not locally delivered. So I think it depends on where you come into the discussion. But I do agree that that distinction should be made because it's getting at different aspects. The culture and the economic aspect, in some ways, can be separate. They can be linked, but there's also a different end when you're looking at them from different lenses. I don't know if anybody here has a comment on that.
I agree with the two of you that these are two different things, but funny enough, in my view, the solution is the same. Regardless if you have an Akamai cluster in your particular country in one or the other flavor, or Google or any other CDN, or if you have an own whatever African CDN or hosting company, as long as the content is in the country and therefore usable for you, and you have an infrastructure which supports that, so you don't have to go back to London or anywhere else, then the solution is the same, right? You want to have the content local, and then you can choose whatever you want to see, if that is then Hollywood, Nollywood, Bollywood, and God knows what there might be else, or if that is the Rwanda Times. The important part is they have to be local. So yeah, you need infrastructure for that, and then you can solve both issues at the same, and then you can choose what you want to see, what interests you.
My take on this is, as far as Rwanda is concerned, I think creation and distribution are equally important. I think at the phase where we are, creation is as well important. I will take the example of educational content. We have a lot of universities that simply don't take advantage of digitalizing that content and distributing it, either through the exchange point or any other ways. So creating it, putting it in a digital format is very important. Redistributing it is as well very important, and for the time being we have quite a challenge in, I guess it's not only in Rwanda, but you accessing a Rwandan content or a content from London, it's more or less the same for the end user, they are paying the same. So we are trying to see how that barrier of price to access something which is localized can be changed as well. Those are the main aspects we're trying to do in Rwanda. Thank you.
Raul, go ahead. Yep.
Thank you. Thank you all. Very good panel. Very interesting presentations. I have a question for William. The last presentation, I like it very much, and I like your approach in your last slide. But I would like to ask you, what do you have in mind, if you can illustrate a little more about what you have in mind about core regulation, and if you can provide some examples. I tend to agree with the idea, but I would like to know what you have in.
Sorry, I don't think I understand the question. You want to know what I mean by co-regulation? Well, a good example of that is, in fact, Chapter 11 of the ECT Act, which makes provision for recognition of an industry body, which is ISPA is the only one recognized in South Africa, although there are a number of industry bodies for the various portions of the industry. And the ISPA has a code of conduct, and part of the process of being recognized was that code of conduct was agreed with the ministry, or in fact the Department of Communications. In fact, that clause was inserted in the Act at my specific request when I spoke to the then DG, and I told him that we were, when the Act was being drafted, I told him we were at the time drafting a code of conduct, and suggested that was included, and it was included. Of course, there's other promises that government would offer online services as part of that was not included, but never mind. So what happened is that essentially government provides recognition of or the minister provides recognition of the industry body, and that then in terms of the Act, gives the legal protection to the members of that industry body, and the terms of the code of conduct are agreed between government and industry, and that's where the co-regulation part comes in. Does that answer your question, sir? Okay. There's another example as well, if you like. In the broadcasting industry, ICASA has accepted that an organisation which falls under the National Association of Broadcasters, called the Broadcast Complaints Commission, is funded by the National Association of Broadcasters, and they deal with complaints about the content of broadcast material. So that the regulator doesn't have to deal with that thing. So it's another way, instead of government recognizing an industry body, that's the regulator recognizing an industry body and empowering the industry body to handle things on its behalf. And it's, at the end of the day, it's a much more efficient way of doing things.
Question back here, and other hands. Are there any other hands after these two? Three. Okay, we'll take these three. Start back there. Oh, four. Okay, go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. My name is Chris Oleke. I'm from Uganda. I'd like to say two things about Ghislaine's presentation. The first is a comment. This is to add to what Kyle had said before. I work with one of the ISPs in Uganda that was benefiting from the Google Cache. We were one of the guys who managed to push the traffic up to the cache. So we had this scenario that we woke up just on one of the days when the ISP hosting the cache just shut down our connection, and suddenly we had so much traffic, going to our transit. This greatly affected our performance, and we were kind of held at ransom by this ISP. So I'd like to say I'm in agreement with the model that Rwanda is using right now of having the having the cache placed at the IXP. That kind of makes it much easier and takes away the whole scenario of you having to be held at ransom by another ISP. Now the second one is it's a question about the Akamai cache that you have in at your IXP. Since Uganda is now looking towards having such a model, you mentioned that the capacity that you're pushing to the local content, local users is about is over 1 Gbps. So in terms of updates, you mentioned one of the ISPs took charge of updating this cache. Do you have any figures in terms of how much bandwidth they use averagely to update this Akamai cache? Thank you.
There is no average number per se, because every country is very specific and very different. If you find us later, we can look at your country. But as I said before, it is roughly 1 to 5. So, so depending on how much demand you have, then you take a fifth of that 20%, or of that, and then you have an idea what the incoming bandwidth is. But it varies from country to country, and probably should talk about that for 30 seconds. End of the day, it pretty much depends on what the end users, basically the eyeballs of that particular provider, are actually looking at. Naturally, because we're an American company, we have a lot of American, therefore English content, more than we have, for example, French content. So if people look more for American websites, but you have a country which probably doesn't speak English very well or is not interested in American content, then you look at different things. Then you probably don't look at videos or websites, but suddenly you would look at social media. So the cache ratio in the inbound and outbound can be very different from country to country. It depends on the population and what kind of language they prefer and what kind of content they prefer. So it's always a good idea that we have a conversation and then we can talk about it. But in general, it is 1 to 5, so whatever, 1 gig in, 5 gig out, 5 gig to the eyeballs, basically the ones which then get served. But if it is 100 Mbit or if it is 10 gig, depends on the population and the infrastructure of the country. So find us later and we have a look at your country.
Dr. Kishorda?
My question is to both Google and Akamai. I ask, do you monitor the fraction of content served by the caches that is generated by users or organizations within a particular country or within a particular organization? That is, if I were to ask you what percentage of this traffic that is going out to our students, for example, is generated by this community or by Kenya, do you monitor that or you just look at traffic?
No, for Google we don't monitor this. That's not really how it works, in fact, because it's really, I think the caches are, I think you should see them as network optimization devices, not so much as content platforms that is going to gather so much data about what the users are doing, what they are watching. It's not really how it works.
It's similar to a certain degree here. So we have certainly an idea, how much traffic goes to a particular AS, if we talk about multiple ASs, or goes into a country. But we do not define user groups. So I wouldn't know anything about your students. I don't even know in which IP range they are, or their name, or anything else. End of the day, they are part of a very large amount of IP addresses which go to that cluster. But we wouldn't know if they are students or if that is residential at home or anything else. We don't look into that level into it.
So the level of data we have, merely, you have it also, and it's on peering.google.com. It's the reporting tool. You see what goes in, what goes out, where it goes to, which prefixes. You can derive which ASNs. But those are really network metrics. They're not very content oriented.
Thank you. I'm Foncham Dendisdo from Cameroon. My question goes to all of you who are content providers. With the rise in content production in Africa, with the rise in content production in Africa, there are chances that many African children will be exposed to unwanted content, especially as many African countries do not have enough legislation on child online protection. And equally, because there is an increase in many more mobile devices, and so children can now access the internet even at locations where their parents cannot monitor them. So I would like to know what you people are doing to make sure that I would like to know what you people are doing to make sure that children can access the internet and benefit from the opportunities that are available on the internet, and to equally be safe while benefiting from these opportunities.
So I think this links more to what William was saying, but essentially I think if you have a child with a smartphone going on the internet, then probably you want to, I don't know, give them a password, limit some apps they are doing. I know Android has some pretty advanced feature to do that. I know Apple has too on their phones. So probably it's more of an education of maybe parents or, I don't know, maybe school towards the children than really some technical countermeasure, because my experience, at least as a naughty kid wanting to go online, is that you can probably bypass any technical limitation that you have against you.
So, the content providers can provide any technical means to provide any. The content providers can't provide any technical means to protect the children online.
No, so basically you have websites for adults, you have websites for kids, and hopefully we hope to match the two and two. So for example, YouTube, there's a YouTube for kids now that shows specifically kids targeted content. So yeah, there is an interest, but I would say the ultimate responsibility lies with the parents or with the education in a sense.
we are a little bit in the lucky position that our customer base is a little bit selective. So when it comes to adult entertainment or whatever you could imagine in that direction, which you do not want that your kid sees, they are usually not our customers. So we are a little bit lucky in that case. But nevertheless, I think this is not so much, if you look from a technology and responsibility perspective, and that goes in the direction what was just said, I think this is either responsibility of the parents and or the access provider. I think it is not one of the particular CDN. You also wouldn't go to a tier 1 which transports a random packet from the left to the right side and then gives it to an eyeball provider and say he has to filter or do something in the middle. He wouldn't know anything about the end user at the other end. And to be honest, this is exactly what you want. You don't want any kind of deep packet inspection boxes or someone actually controlling and monitoring the traffic. There are parties which are responsible for transporting it, tier 1 CDNs, and they are the ones which have a certain responsibility to either look into it or offer protection or not, but they are at the edge. The eyeball provider, the parents, software at home, whatever you might want to choose.
Okay, we'll go to Mark and then we'll wrap it up. Mark.
Thanks, Karen. Mark Tinker, Seacom. I suppose my question is if, like Michuki was asking on the mailing list a couple of weeks ago, if we want to shift that flow of traffic between Africa and Europe and make it, 1090 instead of 9010, we will obviously need all the CDNs on board at some point or other, or as many of them as we can. So obviously, Akamai, Google, and a couple of others have made the move into Africa. And you have your reasons why. Ultimately, you have customers that you need to serve, and you need to make money as well. Do you think that there's a reluctance on the part of the CDNs to come to Africa because they do not see an opportunity to sell CDN services in Africa? Is Africa purely a consumption-based economy for those CDNs?
That is a political and philosophical question. See if I get fired next week for the answer. If you look at the various markets, or what I have seen also from our customers, they are certainly interested in Africa, but a lot of the international companies make probably less business on the African continent than on others. There's also less traffic, as we all know. So I think there's probably less interest to sell or do something. But it is also true actually the other way around. We get, of course, much more questions from Asian, US or European companies to buy services from us, which then the people who have the content, than it is from African companies. So
yes, that's exactly what I meant. So is the challenge that you think you can't sell your services to African content owners? That's what I meant.
Yeah, but it's both ways, right? It is a question, can we sell to them, but also have their interest? So I would actually give it back and say, we haven't seen the interest, which you could interpret as we can't sell to them. They haven't shown the same interest in that. And I guess that has a little bit to do with the infrastructure maturity of a market. If every end user, or a higher degree of end user, has broadband, higher speeds, so that at the moment where you basically put your stuff on a CDN and you do more video than static web pages and stuff like that, where you need more bandwidth, then there is also more interest from the particular companies in acquiring such a service and go for performance. And we haven't seen that from the African continent, really. So at the moment where that changes, and we have also more opportunity to sell, then yeah, that goes. I think it goes already in the right direction. I mean, I was here, South Africa, on the AFPIF 3 years ago, and if you look at the traffic levels, if you look at how many CDNs are now in various countries, all goes in the right direction. So I'm not sure if it will be 2080 or whatever the number will be, but I think it actually goes in the right direction, and with quite a speed. It took like Europe or the US, also 20 years or so to build the internet to a certain standard. So you're actually catching up much faster than we build it, or we as in the Western people in the first place. So I'm actually not as worried. I'm quite happy with the speed and where it goes, and see quite a future.
Great.
Yeah,
And
it's kind of a business thing too. If you have one big American content company that wants to get their content distributed all over Africa, then for sure you'll have the budget to go and deploy CDNs all over Africa. Essentially what Google is doing to a certain extent. And I'm sure if Akamai had a customer that told them, hey, I'm going to pay you $20 million if you deliver with so good latency in Africa, then maybe they have budget to do it. So it will come. I think back to the point that Andrew raised earlier, at the end of the day, I don't like this word because it's overused. It's kind of an ecosystem. So it's hard to imagine that there will be just one content pushing to the users on one continent, but there will be also local content coming up, the local restaurants, the local hotels, the local whatever, that want to get their content local as well and served fast to the local users. So they come hand in hand, and the growth is spectacular, as Christian said. So I think it's just a question of time.
Okay, and just to close out our panel, 30 seconds or less for each panelist. What do you think the top 3 things are that should be done to reduce barriers and encourage better content distribution and production in Africa? Yeah.
For me, it's actually mainly 1 point, but probably 3 times. Does that count? I think
if it's shorter.
I think the biggest point is not, like whatever infrastructure, money, speed, business cases. All that stuff kind of happens when a market grows, right? You just gotta figure it out, have some patience. The biggest difference, I believe, is when all the different people in an ecosystem, sorry for the word, or, around an IX in a country work together to actually solve that. That was the original idea of the whole internet, right? To communicate together and do something together. So if there is a higher, hopefully in the future also, a higher level of trust and collaboration, then I think the rest comes automatically and can be overcome. But if the trust and the collaboration is not, to whatever level that you actually can do something together, then there is not really much point about negotiating a price or doing a port or this or that. And I think the FPIF is a very good example where that actually works, where people are collaborating and, thinking about the bigger picture instead of just, how do I make money for myself and the rest I don't care.
Yeah, so 3 ones. I think content that is relevant locally, more capacity, cheaper capacity, and then just local skills, local goodwill.
I would say maybe 2 things. First, one of the things is happening for the time being, seeing more data center locally, and people like the Anganis who are providing the platform where the content will be sitting. That will be a very good thing. So that is one, and more precisely the local loop pricing. If we can see some interesting pricing for the local loop circuits, that will be very interesting, and it will remove some of the barriers for local content.
It's a bit of a chicken and egg situation. If you don't have an internet exchange point, then you're not going to have any local content to exchange. If you don't have any local content to exchange, you don't need an internet exchange point. What actually tends to happen is that when you set up an internet exchange point, you suddenly discover that you have a great deal more local content than you thought you had. An example is when KIXP was first set up, there were 4 peers there. 3 of them had 64K lines, and 1 of them had a 256K line, and they all set it up, it was all working, and the BGP sessions were going, and they went off and had a beer. They came back the next morning, and everyone's mail servers had fallen over, because there was just enough capacity to start an SMTP hello process, but not enough capacity to actually send the messages. So they completely underestimated the amount of local content, and that's without any local data centers, without any local web hosting of any significance. So once you've got the internet exchange point, then you need the local data centers, so that you can provide content locally. If you don't have an internet exchange point, it doesn't make sense to host data locally. host your website locally. And when you have the data, the websites being hosted locally, then you have the higher speed to it, you have the higher access to it, and you get the higher utility out of it, as we saw in one of the graphs earlier today with the Akamai cache. And with that, you get the necessary skills. People learn how to write the content, how to manage the servers, how to run the data center, and all works out as a virtuous circle. But you have to start. If you don't start, you don't get there. Question was asked yesterday, is it worthwhile having an IXP in a small country? Well, have you got $1,000? Okay, set up an IXP.
Great, thanks a lot. And let's say thanks to the great panel and Mitsuki.